When my boss fired me for being too emotional, I started my own company. 2 years later, his business went bankrupt. Last week he applied for a job at my firm. When he saw me walk into the interview room, he froze. Still emotional? I asked. You're too emotional to lead. He said it with a straight face. In front of HR. In the same room where I once pitched million-dollar campaigns. And just like that, 10 years of loyalty were reduced to a flaw in my personality. I remember that morning vividly. I arrived early as I always did, with a caramel latte in one hand and a folder of campaign ideas in the other. I had stayed up late the night before, sketching out concepts for a new client we'd been chasing for months. I was excited, hopeful even. But the moment I stepped into the office, something felt off. The air was heavy. Conversations stopped when I walked by. Greg, my boss, didn't even look up from his screen when I greeted him. That wasn't like him. He was usually smug but never silent. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just stressed. We had a big pitch coming up and the team had been under pressure. Still, the tension was thick. I caught Jenna, my closest teammate, glancing at me with something between pity and guilt. I smiled at her, but she quickly turned away. That's when I knew something was coming. At 11:58 a.m., a calendar invite popped up. Meeting with Greg, 12 p.m., conference room B. No subject. No context. Just my name and his. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my notebook and walked down the hall, trying to keep my steps steady. The hallway felt longer than usual. Every footstep echoed. Greg was already seated when I arrived. He didn't say hello. He didn't even gesture for me to sit. I took the chair across from him anyway. The blinds were drawn and the room felt colder than usual. I noticed a second chair pulled slightly back from the table. That's when I realized someone else was coming. Sir. Melissa walked in 2 minutes later, holding a manila folder. She gave me a tight-lipped smile and sat beside Greg. My heart started pounding. I looked at Greg, waiting for him to speak. He didn't waste time. I've been reviewing your performance, he said, eyes fixed on the folder. And I've come to a decision. I blinked. Okay. You're not a good fit for this company anymore. I stared at him. What? You're too emotional, he said, finally meeting my eyes. You take things personally. You get too invested. It's disruptive. I felt the heat rise in my chest. Disruptive. That pitch last week, he continued, you got emotional in front of the client. It made people uncomfortable. I clenched my fists under the table. It was a mental health campaign. I shared a personal story. The client connected with it. Greg shrugged. That's not how we do things here. Melissa slid a paper across the table. This is your separation agreement. We're offering 2 weeks severance. I didn't touch the paper. I couldn't move. My mind was racing. I had led that team for 3 years. I had brought in some of our biggest clients. I had worked weekends, holidays, late nights. And now I was being dismissed for caring too much? I stood up slowly. Is that all? Greg nodded. You can collect your things before the end of the day. I walked out of the room in a daze. My legs felt like they didn't belong to me. Back at my desk, a cardboard box was already waiting. Someone had packed my things. My framed photo of Daniel and me, my cactus, my notebooks. Everything was stacked neatly, like I was being erased with care. Jenna approached me quietly. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I hired Aisha first. She was a graphic designer who'd been laid off after returning from maternity leave. Then came Omar, a copywriter who'd been told he was too sensitive for advertising. We were a misfit crew, but we understood each other. We built a culture of empathy. We cried together, laughed together, won together. Our office was still my garage, but it felt like home. We painted the walls ourselves, brought in second-hand furniture, and strung fairy lights across the ceiling. Every Friday we'd order cheap takeout and celebrate the week's wins, no matter how small. A new client. A kind email. A finished project. We celebrated it all. One afternoon I walked into the garage to find Aisha crying at her desk. I panicked. What happened? She looked up, wiping her eyes. Nothing bad. I've never felt this scene before. I sat beside her and we cried together. Not because we were broken, but because we were whole. Emotia wasn't just a company. It was a sanctuary. A place where emotions weren't liabilities, they were superpowers. And every time I looked around that garage I felt proud. Not just of what we were building but of how we were building it. Brick by brick. Tier by tier. And every single one was worth it. The fairy lights above my desk flickered gently as I leaned back in my chair, sipping lukewarm tea. Aisha had just left for the day and the garage-turned-office was quiet. I was reviewing applications for a new senior strategist, someone to help us scale. My assistant, Nita, had shortlisted a few promising candidates. I clicked open the next resume. Greg Walters. I froze. The cursor hovered over his name as my hand trembled slightly. I blinked, thinking maybe it was a coincidence. But no, there it was. His name. His photo. His credentials. He was applying for a role at Emosha. My company. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. The man who once told me I was too emotional to lead was now asking to be part of the very thing I built from the ashes of his dismissal. I didn't say a word to Nita. I didn't forward the resume. I didn't delete it either. I just scheduled the interview. I needed to see him. The day of the interview arrived quietly. I wore a navy blazer and soft cream blouse. Simple, strong. My hair was pulled back neatly and I chose my favorite pearl earrings. I didn't want to look intimidating. I wanted to look like myself. The woman he never saw. I walked past the waiting room around 10:05 a.m. He was seated on the edge of the couch, hands clasped, eyes scanning the room. He looked older. Thinner. His hair had grayed at the temples, and the confident posture I remembered was replaced with something hesitant. He didn't recognize me at first. Then he did. His eyes widened and his mouth parted slightly. I smiled politely, the kind of smile you give a stranger in an elevator. Greg. I said, voice calm. We're ready for you. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie, and followed me down the hall in silence. I could feel the tension in his steps. I didn't rush. I let him absorb every framed photo on the wall. Our campaigns, our team, our awards. All built on the foundation he once dismissed. We entered the conference room. I gestured for him to sit. Nita was already there, ready to take notes. I introduced her briefly, then opened my notebook. Let's begin, I said. Greg cleared his throat. Thank you for the opportunity. I nodded. Tell me about your recent work. He launched into a summary of his last position. How the company folded, how he tried to pivot, how he led a small team through restructuring. His words were rehearsed, but his eyes kept flicking toward me, searching for something familiar. I stayed composed, jotting down notes, asking questions. What would you say was your biggest failure? I asked. He hesitated. I suppose, not adapting fast enough. Not seeing the shift in culture. I tilted my head. Culture. He nodded. The emotional intelligence movement. Empathy and leadership. I underestimated it. I let that sit for a moment. And what did you learn from that? He looked down. That people aren't just resources. They're people. I didn't respond. I wanted him to sit with that truth. The interview continued. I asked about strategy, conflict resolution, creative direction. He answered, but his confidence wavered. He kept glancing at me, trying to find the old version of me. The one who cried in the restroom, who packed her things in silence. But she wasn't here anymore. I was the boss now. Toward the end, I closed my notebook and leaned forward slightly. Greg, I said, voice steady. Do you remember what you said to me the day you let me go? He swallowed. I think I do. You said I was too emotional to lead. He nodded slowly. Yes. I looked him in the eye. Still emotional? He didn't answer. Just stared. His face softened and I saw something I hadn't expected, regret. Not just for firing me but for never understanding me. For never seeing the value in what I brought to the table. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just let the silence speak. After a few moments I stood up. Thank you for coming in. He stood too, unsure. Will I hear back? I nodded. We'll be in touch. I walked him to the door myself. The hallway felt longer this time, but I didn't rush. As we reached the exit, I paused. I hope you find what you're looking for, I said. He looked at me, eyes tired. I think I already did. That night, I sat at my desk, the fairy lights casting soft shadows on the wall. I didn't feel victorious. Felt whole. I had faced the man who once broke me and I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. I had built something beautiful, something lasting, something real. And I had done it by being exactly who I was. Emotional. Passionate. Human. I didn't hire Greg. Not out of spite, but because he didn't fit. His resume was strong, but his presence didn't align with our culture. My team deserved someone who understood empathy not as a trend but as a truth. The next morning I sent the rejection email myself. Short. Professional. Kind. Then I opened my journal and wrote a new line beneath the old one. I proved him wrong. And this time I underlined it just once. That was enough.